Well, good morning, Crosspoint. I hope you're having a great weekend. And I want to get your attention this morning to the idea of good grace. We've been talking a little bit about grace over the last several weeks, working that in around some of our holiday times and so on. But I want to go back to that topic of grace and remind us that we have the good grace of God. As believers in Jesus Christ, grace should be a part of our reputation. When people look at us and they know we're a Christ follower, they should know that we're a person who has not only received the grace of God, but we are a person who lives the grace of God as well. Were you ever told that you need to live up to something? I know over the years I've been a part of a number of teams, baseball teams, basketball teams, track teams, and so on. I've also been a part of singing groups, and in high school I was in the marching band, and we won a lot of competitions. Johnson City had a great marching band back in the day, and we were always told every year when we showed up, the years before, Johnson City High School Band had an outstanding reputation, and we need to continue that. And so there was kind of that pressure, to live up to something. Maybe you've been told that about your family reputation in the community. I can remember my dad always told us, people know that we're Christians and that we go to the church up the street, and they expect us to live accordingly. And so those expectations were put upon us. You may have known someone who claimed to be a Christian but who never exhibited the grace of God, and someone would say to you, well, I thought they were supposed to be a Christian. Well, the idea is they were not living up to the expectation, or they were not being worthy of the calling that God gave them in their lives. And we're going to talk about that this morning. You can only uphold the standard of being a truly Christ follower by the grace of God and having the grace of God a part of your life. Now, we talked a few weeks ago about the presence of God. About the presence of God's grace in our lives. According to Ephesians chapter 4, each one of us has been given grace. We don't deserve it. We don't deserve to stand before God as holy and sinless and pure, but we can be clothed in His righteousness by faith through grace. And by grace we are saved through faith. And we talked about the power of grace as well a couple of weeks ago, and how the power of grace has brought salvation to us. But there's another aspect if you continue in that passage in Ephesians chapter 2. In verse 10 it says, "For we are God's handiwork, created in Christ Jesus, to do good works, which God prepared in advance for us to do." Make sure that you take note of the fact that grace is a done deal. You've been given grace, Ephesians 4:7. You don't have to hope for grace. You don't have to pray for grace. You don't have to look for grace. You have it. Now, the unfortunate thing is some people have it, but they buried it. It's like the person who had millions of dollars and went in the backyard and dug a hole and put it in there and never used it to the benefit of anyone. Well, grace is somewhat like that as well. We have God's grace. We can't bury it. We can't suppress it. In fact, we need to use it. We need to make sure we are functioning as Christ followers in the grace of God. I'm reminded of another passage in 2 Corinthians, and I want to just share a little bit of this with you. 2 Corinthians chapter 5, beginning with verse 17 and going into chapter 6, we read this. "Therefore, if anyone is in Christ, the new creation has come. The old has gone, the new is here. All this is from God, who reconciled us to Himself through Christ and gave us the ministry of reconciliation." Well, that ministry of reconciliation is the ministry of passing on the grace of God through our lives to the lives of others. Paul goes on in verse 19, 2 Corinthians 5, that God was reconciling the world to himself in Christ. Listen to this. Not counting people's sins against them. That's grace, isn't it? And he has committed to us the message of reconciliation. He's committed to us that ministry of grace. We are therefore Christ's ambassadors, as though God were making his appeal through us. We implore you on Christ's behalf, be reconciled to God. God made him who had no sin to be sin for us, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. Once again, that's what? It's grace. And then Paul says this in chapter 6, verse 1. As God's co-workers, again, going back to Ephesians 2, 8, and 9, and 10, we are created for works to honor God. As God's co-workers, we urge you not to receive God's grace in vain. In other words, don't waste God's grace. In our modern thinking, it might be like we have a free app. We have the app of grace in our life. But if you never click on it, if you never go into it, if you never research it out, if you never use it, it doesn't do you any good. Do not receive God's grace in vain. Imagine if you were out of work and you were in desperate need and someone came to you and they said, hey, look, I have a phenomenal job for you. It pays very well. In fact, not only does it pay well, it provides housing and free meals, but you need to go and you need to check in with this person in human resources, and they will set you up. It's a done deal. I've already talked to them, and you're good to go. And you say, oh, great, thanks, I want to do that. And so you set an appointment, and the day comes for your appointment to go check in, to get all the paperwork done, and all that was involved in that. And you decide, well, I'm a little tired this morning. I think I'm going to sleep in a little bit. And if I'm an hour late or whatever, it doesn't really matter. And so you go in an hour late, and the human resource guy's a little questionable about your character already at this point, but he's very gracious. And he gives you all the outline. He has you sign the paper and gets you plugged into the job. Well, the first day comes around. And again, you decide you're going to sleep in a little bit. You're tired. You want to go in really energized. I mean, you don't want to go in tired and groggy on the first day of work, so you show up an hour late. Well, obviously, that's going to be questioned, but they're thinking, well, it's new guy, it's his first day on the job, he's maybe a little nervous, running a little bit behind. Well, the second day comes, the third day comes, and the same thing keeps going on and on. Fourth day comes, and you decide, well, you know, there's a ball game going on at noon, and I want to watch that, so I think I'll go in after the ball game. Well, you know what eventually is going to happen. All of the grace that's been extended to you in getting you that job and providing that job for you was wasted because you're going to be out in the cold once again without a job. Now we say, well, that's silly. We understand that. But the reality is that's how many people live their lives when it comes to the exercise of the grace of God. They never plug into it. They don't live it out. They don't appreciate it. They don't take advantage of the grace of God. Do not receive the grace of God in vain. You have grace to live. You have grace to serve. It is given to us. As I said, we don't hope for it. We don't pray for it. We don't look for it. We have it. Well, back again in the book of Ephesians chapter 4, Paul gives us a number of helps in leaning into the grace of God, so that we don't waste the grace that God has given us. And this morning, I'm just going to look at one of those things, and we'll look at another one next week. But in Ephesians 4, 1 through 7, Paul starts off, I urge you, and that word urge is the same word we see in Romans 12, 1, when Paul says, brothers, I urge you by the mercies of God to present your bodies a living sacrifice. He says, I urge you, I beg you, I plead strongly, I encourage you. I want to have as great an emphasis as I can on this because it's important. I want to get your attention. So I urge you, he says, to live a life worthy of the calling you have received. And the aspect of the grace of God that I want you to think about this morning is the idea of being worthy. Be a worthy recipient of the grace of God. I urge you to live a life worthy. Now, 5 times in chapters 4 and 5 of Ephesians, Paul instructs his leaders or his readers to either live or walk in a certain way. The interesting thing is that word live or the word walk is the exact same Greek word. It's just translated either live or walk. In verse 1 of chapter 4, he says, live or walk worthy of the calling you have received. In verse 17, he says, do not live or walk like the Gentiles. So we have to walk worthy one way, but do not walk, like the world. In chapter 5 and verse 2, he says, walk or live in the way of love. In verse 8, chapter 5, he says, live or walk as children of the light. And then in verse 15 of chapter 5, he says, be careful. He's given a warning. Again, don't waste this grace. Be careful how you live or walk. Because if you claim the name of Christ, you have a reputation. People know that. And they have expectations about that reputation. The idea of living or walking, those 2 words specifically, appear 96 times in the New Testament. And generally, it's metaphorically, as it is in this passage. It's about your behavior, the span of life, years that make up your life. You are to walk or live worthy during that time. That's your reputation. I think it runs a little deeper, however, than just living a particular way, because Paul says walk worthy of the calling. And I think a lot of people misunderstand what God's grace has called us to. The idea of that calling is the same word that can be translated work, or more contemporary word might be vocation. Walk worthy of the vocation. And some translators have used that word, vocation, in this text. It implies your work, your life's work. So if we have God's grace and it is our calling, it is our life's work, how are we doing with that? I think oftentimes we think Christianity is just a spectator sport, and we kind of sit back and we go through every day appreciating the grace of God, but never really fleshing it out or working it out in our own lives, and certainly not applying it to our relationships with other people. But we're to walk worthy of the vocation, of the calling that God has in our life. The calling of being a Christian is more than just a secondary calling. We might be a plumber, a teacher, we might be a pastor, a missionary, we might be someone who works in engineering or in sciences, but the reality is, if you've placed your faith in Jesus Christ, your calling is to be a reconciler of the grace of God, extending that grace to the lives of those who need it. Are you worthy of that? Are you worthy of the grace of God? The word worthy relates to value. It means worth. And it would be a shame if we had something of great worth and we didn't really appreciate it. Now, I don't know about you, but when I make a purchase, I like to walk away with the feeling that I got a really good deal. Do you feel the same way? Well, a couple years back, I had a pair of really nice skis, and somehow I ended up breaking one of them, and so I was without skis. Now, I had been saving some money for quite a while. I had a little envelope that I keep in my desk drawer. If I would come up with a couple of extra bucks, I would stick it in there. It says skiing right on the envelope. And after quite a bit of time, I had $300 in that envelope. Well, if you're not a skier, you're probably not aware that the price of skis has gone up extensively over the last 20, 30 years. And I had a friend who was a really good skier, and he bought a brand new pair of skis. I know the list price on those skis was $1,350. That included the bindings. They were top of the line ski, and he only skied on them once, and he didn't like them. And he heard I broke my ski, and he said, hey, I'll give you a good deal on these skis. And I'm thinking, well, what is a good deal? And originally he said, well, I was thinking if I could get $600 or $700 out of them, that's half price, that would be giving someone a good deal. And I said to my friend, I said, John, I said, I appreciate that, and that is a terrific deal, but I only have $300. That's all I had saved at that point, and that's all the money I had. I couldn't come up with any more. And without hesitation, he said, you know something? I want you to have those skis. I'll give them to you for $300. I was like, wow, what a deal that was. That was a phenomenal deal. And you know, that's really the way it is with the grace of God. God gives us this grace that is really something we could never afford. It's something we could never earn or work for. And yet he gives it to us. And I thought, am I worthy to ski on those skis? Am I worthy to ski on those $1,300 skis? Well, I don't know, but I had them. And I'm still skiing on them today, and that's been a number of years. But you know, how about the grace of God that's been given to us? We have it. It's worth much, much more than we could ever afford or pay. I was thinking about this, and I thought, the sacrifice of Jesus is what demonstrates the grace of God to us. It was his sacrifice. Is the life that I am living worth the sacrifice of Christ? Let me say that again. I want you to get a hold of this. Is the life that I am living worth the sacrifice of Christ? By his grace we are saved. By his grace we can serve. But are we living worthy of that grace? Well, Paul has another characteristic in that passage as well, but we're going to wait till next week to get into that. But again, I want to leave you with that question because I think it is a very important one. Are you worthy of the grace of God that you have received? God bless. Enjoy our closing song, and we're going to pick up here next week with another issue dealing with the grace of God and what it has given us and how it can be effective in our lives. God bless. Go in peace.